Well, welcome everyone to the Virginia Agribusiness Council's Legislative Update webinar. With me today is Brad Copenhaver and Heidi Hertz. Uh, we represent the legislative team here at the Virginia Agribusiness Council, and we're very excited to share with you all of the policy that made it or didn't make it this year. I want to specifically thank RISE for sponsoring today's event. We have a lot of really strong sponsors and supporters of the Agribusiness Council throughout the session this year, and getting information out uh, to our membership and the general public after session is just as important. So I really want to thank Rise for stepping up and helping us out with this presentation. With that in mind, I also want to share that this meeting is being recorded. We are recording this for the benefit of our membership. This will be available for everyone on our webpage after the fact. That said, we'll get into it real quick. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to share those in the chat throughout the session, and then we'll get to it when we get to the end. And with that, I will introduce Brad Copenhaver with MetaView Strategies to get us started.
All right, thanks, Cliff. Can everybody hear me? All right, good deal. Thanks again to Rise for sponsoring today, and I'll talk a little bit about our partnership with Rise as well. I know John is on the call, and John was a big help during session with a couple of bills that we were working on, so I'll talk about that a little later. But as Cliff said, I'm Brad Copenhaver. Heidi Hertz from Cozen Public Strategies is also on the call. She's the other member of our government affairs team, along with Cliff. And we had a very busy, productive session, and it is still not quite over, but we thought now would be a good time to give our session update. So wanted to just kind of take a look back at what we talked about in November to see if these predictions that Cliff, Heidi, and I shared at the annual meeting kind of came true. So we talked about the new building and several new members of the General Assembly, 40% turnover in the legislature, and kind of what that would mean for policy moving forward. We said that really the primary matchup this session was going to be the Democrats versus the governor. And I think that has really proven to be true, and it's still going on right now. We can talk a little bit about that. We talked about the fact that it's a budget year, which is kind of influencing every single thing that we're talking about this year, and again, still continues to influence some of the legislation that we're talking about in addition to the budget items, and then lots of unpredictability. And I think Heidi and Cliff and anyone else who was working this session would also agree with me that it was pretty unpredictable. I mean, a lot of the same issues that we've worked on in the past came up, but it was kind of hard to predict how this new crop of legislators and the new leadership in both chambers was going to work on them. And then the challenges and opportunities for agriculture. The urban and rural split got wider. We'll talk a little bit about how that came into play. Contingencies, we thought that they would come out strong, like the environmentalists, and they definitely did. And we'll talk about kind of some of the things regarding water quality, solar, pesticides, that sort of thing, where they came out a lot stronger than they have in the past, and kind of what happened to that those pieces of legislation. At that point, we didn't know who our committee leadership was going to be. We know now. So Dave Marsden became the chair of the Senate Ag Committee, and Alfonso Lopez became the chair of the House Ag Committee. And those are two folks who have been around for a long time, and we know them really well, but they're from very urban areas in Northern Virginia. And so that played a lot into kind of how those committees were going to view things this year, but we have very good relationships with both of those Ag Committee chairmen. New members, the hottest issues are complex, and that was a challenge, talking about things like the minimum wage and solar policy, and those types of things were very hot issues, and new members were very passionate about them, but they're complex. And so we had spend a lot of time sitting down with those folks and kind of going through the ins and outs of these policy areas in ways that we hadn't had to do in the past. Plenty of opportunities, and I think we really did a good job of taking advantage of these. Strong relationships and established trust with remaining legislators. For example, those Ag Committee chairmen, even though they're from Northern Virginia, and may see things a little bit differently. We have decades in some cases of working with them. And so it was really, really good to have those established relationships going into the session. And then we built off wins from past years. And again, like I said before, those complex issues meant opportunities to educate those new members. And I think we took advantage of that as well. So kind of getting into an overview of this General Assembly session. 60 crazy days, started second week of January, kicked it off with a great Virginia Agribusiness Council Legislative Appreciation Banquet, as we do every year. And in total, we had over 2,200, almost 2,300 bills introduced. And that's not including the resolutions, commending resolutions, memorial resolutions, and the constitutional amendments, which were introduced but put off until next year because they generally do those in odd numbered years because there has to be an election intervening for those to pass. Of those, just over 1,000 passed both houses and went to the governor for his consideration. The governor has vetoed dozens of bills so far. I think the latest count that I saw was 91, which is a record of any governor in history, including 3 that we asked him to, and we'll talk about these, but the English Ivy bill, the minimum wage bills, and the farm worker minimum wage bill. So today, actually, April 8th, is the last day for the governor to act on any legislation. And he has an announcement at 1 o'clock up the hill at the Patrick Henry Building to kind of talk about what his plans are for the budget, and I'm assuming for a lot of the remaining bills that are out there. And then the reconvene session is next week, April 17th, when everyone will come back into town and kind of consider what they're going to do with his vetoes and amendments. So as we were working on putting this presentation together last week, I was thinking, we only have an hour to do this, and there were a lot of things that we worked on this session. And so this is a really long list. We tried to pare it back from all the things we worked on, and we'll spend a lot of time on some things here at the beginning and then some less time on the things at the end. But just to give you a sense of the breadth of issues that we worked on this General Assembly session, I think this will do it, and this will kind of guide our conversation today as we jump right into the minimum wage issue. So this was a big deal for the Democrats coming in this session. You can see HB1 and SB1. These were the very first bills that the Democrats filed to raise the minimum wage in Virginia to $15 an hour by 2026, kind of ramping up starting this year, and then 2025 would ramp up more, and then $15 an hour by 2026. This is this is kind of finishing some of the work that Democrats started when they had the majority, when they had a trifecta majority previously, but there was reenactment language on that, and so they had to come back and do it again. This was one of the bills that we asked the governor to veto, along with several other business organizations, and he did. We also did a lot of work kind of raising awareness on social media, testifying in front of committees, working with legislators, and member Moyer Beamer from down in Carroll County submitted an op-ed to Cardinal News, and we had several other folks I know around the state kind of doing the same thing. And that ties into also HB 157, which was sponsored by 2 freshman delegates, Adele McClure from up in Northern Virginia and Phil Hernandez from down in Southeast Virginia, would have removed the farm worker and the foreign guest worker exemption from minimum wage. Now, there were at one point a long list of exemptions to the minimum wage. The legislature a few years ago got rid of most of those, but left the farm worker exemption. And then also we added in the foreign guest worker exemption to make sure that minimum wage law doesn't impact the A word that our farmers have to pay when they bring in temporary workers through the H-2 programs. This was also on our list of asking for the governor to veto, which he also did. We kind of talked about HB1, SB1, and HB 157 all together as impacting the agriculture industry, and we're really, really appreciative for the governor for his veto on this. And also want to say how appreciative we are for some of our strongest supporters in the General Assembly kind of standing up and talking on our behalf, both in committee meetings and on the floor of the various chambers about this legislation. And I think this is one of those areas where we spent a lot of time in offices with people with mountains of data and examples to talk about why the agriculture industry is different and how the minimum wage that may apply to other industries doesn't necessarily fit with agriculture because of the way that we do things differently. So, this became a party line issue. These both passed on party line votes through both chambers, and then the governor ended up vetoing them. And so the General Assembly will not have the power to override that veto when they come back next week. Moving on to another really hot topic this year, invasive species. This is kind of, we were in Blacksburg on Friday for the Virginia Tech Cal's Dean's Advisory meeting, and they're doing a lot of invasive species work, and kind of the lead professor from the College of Agriculture was speaking, and he said invasive species is kind of having a moment right now. And I think a lot of people are capitalizing on that for good reason. But there were a couple bills that were problematic for the nursery industry. One, HB 1167 from Delegate Krizik would have allowed a locality to prohibit the sale of English ivy. Passed almost totally on party lines. It almost died in the Senate Ag Committee. It was a tie vote, and then they brought it back up and were able to pass it. We worked pretty extensively on this to try to educate people about the harms that having a patchwork of regulations regarding to which plants could be sold and which plants couldn't be sold, how harmful that would be. But alas, it did end up passing, and we requested a veto from the governor, and really appreciate his vetoing this bill as well. We worked hand in hand with the Virginia Nursery and Landscape Association on this bill. This was one of their top issues this session as well. Another one kind of in this vein, HB 47 SB 306, Delegate Holly Seabold from Northern Virginia and new Senator Saddam Salim from Northern Virginia would have required signage in proximity to native plants in a retailer. We worked on this bill throughout session. It had several different iterations, but basically we negotiated this to a point where the nursery industry thought that they could live with it, and we were okay with this, and we communicated that throughout the process. It ended up going into a conference committee that was a long and kind of arduous process to get this bill where it was. But the governor ended up vetoing this bill as well. This was not requested by us, but he did end up vetoing this bill. I think this is something that we're going to have to continue to work on. The nursery industry has done a lot of work in the education space around what invasive species are, why it's important to consider when and if to plant them or where to plant them, what native plants are and how to choose them. And so I think that our efforts going forward, again, are going to focus a lot more on that education work as the industry continues to kind of work on that issue. Another one on the invasive species kind of list of bills is HB 320 from Delegate David Bulova, who's one of our top partners on all the things that we do. He actually won the council's Distinguished Friend of Agribusiness Award, the Legislator Award this year. This bill would allow volunteers to use non-restricted pesticides to combat invasive species on public lands. This was pretty heavily amended by the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services kind of throughout the process to make sure it's tightened up and that those volunteers still have to follow several of the procedures that our commercial applicators have to apply. But this was kind of a way, there was a locality in Northern Virginia that wanted to be able to use more volunteers on some of their public lands to spray for these invasive species. The council ended up taking no position on this bill. We didn't really have a policy that spoke to it, and I think though it ended up in a really good place, kind of making sure that it was aligned with our safety protocols that we already have. But I think the other good thing is that it really demonstrates the efficacy of some of the chemistries that are out there to deal with invasive species. Food safety was another issue that we worked on quite a bit. We didn't have any really have any raw milk bills this year, which we've had in the past. But HB 759 was lovingly called by the end of session the pickle and cake pop bill. Originally, the bill raised the kind of removed the cap on the amount of acidified vegetables that could be sold at a farmer's market. This was a compromise that had been negotiated between the Agribusiness Council and the Food Freedom kind of coalition several years ago, maybe a decade ago. What ended up happening in the compromise, which we were neutral on after we discussed it, it raised the amount from $3,000 to $9,000, and then out of an incident that came regarding cake pops at the end of last year, where a cake pop producer here in the Richmond area was kind of advertising and advertising online and selling at certain events, was kind of slapped on the hand by VDAX. And the governor decided to make this kind of one of his marquee issues of this year. But it clarifies where things can be sold, or where things can be advertised online, and at which temporary events home produced foods can be sold. So not just farmers markets, but things like craft shows and that sort of thing as well. And so we decided to stay neutral on this bill. I think it was probably a good compromise, and really reduces the amount of public health impact. But again, like I said, it became a marquee issue for the governor, and he had a signing ceremony out at the governor's mansion with big cardboard cake pops included and everything. So it was a big issue for him. Broadband pole attachments. I see we have a couple of our co-op folks on here, so if they have anything to add, please feel free to jump in. But HB 800 and SB 713. Basically, this is a complicated issue, but it would have changed the way costs are distributed for pole replacements between broadband providers and electric co-ops. And suffice to say, in its original form, this is a really, really bad bill. It would have resulted in raised rates, to say the least, but would have just been a sea change in kind of the way we do policy for our electric co-ops. And we took a pretty strong position on this. Cliff submitted an op-ed to the pilot in opposition to this. But I just want to thank our co-op friends for all the work that they did on this legislation throughout the session. It was very heavily negotiated and ended up in a place of compromise. But this was originally a very bad bill, and thanks to the work of a lot of people, ended up in an okay place. All right, moving on to the Office of Farmland Preservation. HB 892, SB 616, David Bulva and Senator Todd Pillion from down in Southwest. This is something that folks have been talking about for a number of years. Kind of, how do we make the Office of Farmland Preservation at VDAX more efficient, able to preserve more land? How do we kind of tie into some of the work that we're doing in other state agencies? And the solution that we came up with is to move the Office of Farmland Preservation from VDAX to the Department of Forestry, to create what we're calling a brand new Office of Working Lands, to preserve both working farmland and working forest land. It takes advantages of a lot of efficiencies and some of the resources that DOF has that VDAX doesn't have, so things like GIS capability, but really importantly, the actual ability within the code to hold easements. The Department of Forestry, most folks don't realize, is the second highest easement holder among any state agency behind the Outdoors Foundation. And so they have a lot of experience, a lot of work actually doing this. And so this was several months of work by the administration, the agriculture community, conservation community. We supported this bill. And this is one of those success stories about where we worked on all the issues prior to session, and there wasn't any opposition to this. So this thing kind of sailed through the process, and then there were several associated budget items, really technical fixes, kind of moving funds from one section of the budget to another. There's one position at VDAX that's going to be impacted, kind of moving over to DOF, but those were all included in the budget, and we'll be working over the next few months to make sure that this transition happens smoothly. But I think this is a really positive development for farmland preservation. Solar siting. This was one of those where I kind of mentioned that the environmental community and the solar kind of solar energy community felt really emboldened coming into this session. And so there were several bills that came up on this. You might remember a couple of years ago, HB 206, that Delegate Weber had, which kind of creates a process to mitigate the effects of placing solar developments, solar installations on prime agricultural land or prime forest land. And so DEQ has been working over the last 2 years. We've been very involved in this and kind of what that process looks like, what developers have to do to mitigate for that. And in addition to that, there are several localities who have put their own restrictions on kind of where solar can be placed and how that process works. So the solar industry kind of came this session with some ideas for how to override that. So the two that were kind of the biggest, nastiest bills were SB 697 and Senator Van Valkenburg. And I'm sorry, if Senator, if he sees us at some point, call this bill a nasty bill, but it was problematic. He remains a good friend to us, but we disagreed on this issue. It would have removed local land use authority for siting of solar projects unless 4% of the locality's land has been put under solar. And so until they reach that cap, they would not have really a say on kind of the siting process. So this was heavily opposed by local governments and agriculture and forestry folks. It did pass the Senate narrowly, but it died in the House in a subcommittee. We spoke up against this. Cliff came down and spoke against us several times. But this issue is not going away. He told me, after his bill died, he wants to work on this. He wants to sit down with us at some point in the next few months, but he wants to bring this bill back in the future. Another one kind of in the same vein, this was actually a much broader bill. HB 636 by Rip Sullivan would have allowed the State Corporation Commission to completely override a local land use decision related to solar siting. So a solar company, if they feel like they weren't kind of getting the treatment at the local level that they needed, could appeal to the SEC, who could then override and they could determine where that siting take place. This was also opposed by local governments and all of us in ag and forestry. Delegate Sullivan, he kind of toyed with us throughout the beginning of session about what he was going to do with this bill. I think he really cares a lot about it, and he wants to see a fix to this issue. But he asked for it to be carried over to 2025, so it's dead for this year. But I think he does intend to bring this issue back next year. And so this, you see in big bold letters down at the bottom, it's not going away, and something that we're going to have to continue to work on in 2024. This is going to be one of the things that I know we're going to be talking about next week with Senator Marsden. He's kind of drawing some folks together. You may have read about that in the news for a little summit to talk about some of these issues. So this will definitely be on the agenda. A little note at the bottom as well. I didn't list these out, but anyone has any other questions about these offline, we can chat about them. We supported several bills in accordance with our policy at the council to provide incentives to site solar projects away from ag and forestry. And one good example that passed that was very bipartisan was brownfield sites. So providing some incentives from some of our state funds to actually site solar on brownfield sites rather than on ag and forest land. So those are some good things that we stood up along with the solar industry and the environmental community and others and supported and said this is a good idea. So that was an area of agreement. Moving on to taxes, the estate tax, which was repealed, I think in 2006, someone correct me if I'm wrong. But ever since then, Vivian Watts, who's a longtime delegate from up in Northern Virginia, has been working to reinstate the state tax. This year, HB 1414 was carried by Delegate Elizabeth Bennett Parker from Alexandria. This is another one of those issues where we spent several hours going through kind of the ins and outs of this policy area and how our industry could be affected. We voiced pretty major opposition Again, this is another one of those bills that they decided to carry over to next year, so it's dead for now, but likely coming back again. This is um, Delegate Watts. This is a really, really important issue for her, especially as chair of the Finance Committee. There were lots of other tax issues, some regarding tax credits, tax treatment for conservation programs and that sort of thing, which I'll mention later. Lots of tax issues going on in the budget, which we may learn a little bit more about here in about half an hour. But a standoff between the governor and the General Assembly, things like the electronic sales tax, B2B issue, and certain tax rates, which all will influence kind of what the revenue projections are. And so that's something that is just kind of at a macro level, one of the biggest things that they're negotiating right now. I'm going to turn it over to Heidi to talk about some of the really great food access work that we did this session as well.
Thanks, Brad. So wanted to just for a minute reflect on the Virginia Food Access Coalition and the relationship that the Agribusiness Council has with VFAC to really help them with some infrastructure, some administrative support, but then also we are benefiting from the additional scope and the additional relevance that their issues and their primary mission has related to the Agribusiness Council. And one of the things that was very striking during session was that because of the partnership with the Virginia Food Access Coalition, the Agribusiness Council was in a couple of different conversations, maybe even different committees than the Agribusiness Council has been in the past. And it was a really great opportunity to talk about the good work of the Agribusiness Council and engage with some of the newer legislators that we wouldn't have had the chance to work with. Don't want to take too much time, but we did spend a lot of time focusing on bills that were related to child nutrition, local food programs, programs for college students and seniors, and other things that were related to food access, and then also some budget action, some that came in through the governor's proposed budget, but then also some that were budget amendments that various members carried. But you can see on the right-hand side that, you know, the vast array of topics that we engaged on. Some delegates that maybe we haven't worked with in the past, or senators. We did engage on Delegate Price. She was working to establish a commission to end hunger, which, similar to some of the technical advisory committees, would also bring together legislative, but then also stakeholders to work on ending hunger. School meals for all was a big topic, both legislatively as a policy decision, but also the funding aspects of it. And one of the realities is that, you know, when we talk about federal nutrition programs like School Meals for All, like SNAP, like WIC, leveraging those federal nutrition dollars and bringing them back into Virginia can significantly help the local economy and help feed families and kiddos that need assistance. And so it's a nice way for us to engage on some of those topics. Also worked with Delegate Cousins and Senator Rome on Hunger Free Campus, so trying to target universities and colleges to provide food assistance programs and grants for needed. Engaged significantly on Delegate Cousins and Senator Rome's work around establishing a farm to school task force. There's been a long-time partnership between the Department of Education and Department of Agriculture on increasing the local food procurement by local school divisions. It's a complex topic, and a task force is one of those strategies to try and pull people together to have a really meaningful conversation. That is one bill that the governor, or two bills that the governor has yet to act on. So I'm not sure what they're thinking about when it comes to establishing this task force. And then further with our food access work, working with Senator Rome, she has had programs in the past to do federal nutrition program outreach like SNAP at food banks, and thought it might be a good idea to also engage the Women, Infants, and Children's program as well. So just a few call outs for some of the work that we've done, and appreciate the Food Access Coalition, their work. There were individual members in committees, but then also a great opportunity for the Agribusiness Council to engage and be involved on these.
Yeah, and just to echo what Heidi said, this, I think strategically, it was really good for the council, and I think to continue this work, but to work with, number one, to work with some of these legislators that we normally may not cross paths with a lot or collaborate with, and kind of build those relationships. But a lot of these are very, you know, all these bills right here are very good policy that would impact the agribusiness industry in a positive way, and to kind of add that other angle as we're talking through why these are good policies. Was really productive this session, and I think we'll just continue to build on that. And so thanks, Heidi, and thanks to everyone at the Food Access Coalition. So moving on to pesticides, there was a really bad bill that came up this year, and I want to shout out to John at Rise for helping out with this. But this is kind of in the suite of bills that are coming up in different states across the country regarding preemption with regard to pesticides. And so HB 922, which was introduced by Delegate Irene Shin, would have allowed homeowners associations to restrict the use of pesticides. On its face, maybe doesn't seem like a huge policy shift, but anything that kind of takes us away from the model of the label is the law and EPA setting those standards would be very, very problematic. And so we talked through that with Delegate Shin. We talked through that with Delegate Bolda, who's the chair of the General Laws Committee where this bill went, and expressed our opposition. I think we found a lot of folks who understood where we were coming from. And once again, this was something that died for this session, was continued to 2025. I'm not sure if Delegate Shin is planning on bringing this back up again next year after kind of learning everything that we had to say, but we'll be prepared if this bill or anything else like it comes up again next year. But we had all of our resources kind of at the thrown at this. We had one-pagers and talking points, and we had people ready to testify, but it turned out that we didn't need to use any of that because we were able to convince them, and she was willing to carry over the bill. Another one that came up this year was with regard to leaf blowers and gas-powered leaf blowers. This is not something that we really engaged in a lot, but I just wanted to bring it up because I think it's something that's going to continue to come up. HB 644, SB 305, Rip Sullivan, Saddam Salim would have allowed a locality to restrict the use of gas-powered leaf blowers. We watched this very, very closely, talked to both of the patrons about this. It was really about ostensibly what it was about was from residents in their communities concerned about the noise of gas-powered leaf blowers. But I think it also has some environmental components to it as well. The green industry and kind of our lawn care folks are moving away from gas-powered leaf blowers, but still watch these pretty closely to make sure other equipment, types of equipment, were not going to be included in this. They got a lot of press this year, and even in one of the committee hearings, someone brought up gas-powered lawnmowers, and so that was the first time that I'd actually heard that discussed. But I think that gas-powered anything in terms of equipment is probably in the crosshairs of certain folks, and so we're going to keep an eye on this issue. These bills died pretty easy deaths this year. But this is not something that's going to go away pretty easily. So we'll be on the lookout next year for those as well. Veterinary issues. We had a lot actually of things related to our folks in the veterinary industry this year. So the first and biggest one was really a top priority for the agriculture industry was a study of needs for large animal veterinarians. This is something that we hear time and again from all corners of the state. About the shortage of large animal vets. And so the Board of Veterinary Medicine, and along with our state vet from VDAX, is going to study the needs for large animal veterinarians and make some recommendations to the General Assembly about policy moving forward and what we might want to do to address that. Only a handful, 5 or 6 studies made it through this year. They generally try to limit that because they take some state resources and time and money. And this was one of those studies that made it through this year. And so big thanks to Chairman Lopez and Senator Hackworth for carrying these as we testified in committees and had the discussions with folks about these. I think this was something that pretty much every member of the legislature agreed with is a major issue and that we want to do something to address this moving forward. Another issue that was a big priority for the veterinary industry is satellite offices. So this gets kind of technical in how veterinarians are regulated by the board, but this would kind of create a separate category of satellite offices, which could actually be, in most cases, for large animal vets who are doing work out on a farm, could be their work truck or something similar. In the past, those had not been regulated, and there was some question about kind of how they were operating within the spaces that they needed to by the board. And so the veterinarians kind of worked on this issue in the off season, came up with legislation that was pretty much universally agreed was good, but the House version died on the House floor because of some political squabbles that were going on related to a completely different issue. But the Senate version passed with flying colors, and so that's something that we're going to be able to address this year. Xylazine is an issue that we weren't planning on working on, but this is a bill that came up. Xylazine is used in the veterinary sense as a large animal, mostly cattle, tranquilizer. But right now it's being sold illicitly, kind of on the streets with fentanyl and other opioids to increase their strength. It's very, very dangerous coming from places overseas. And so to address this, the original bill would have scheduled xylazine. There's only one producer for veterinary use in the United States. And that would have made it very difficult to have a drug on the scheduled list, makes it very difficult to import that into the state and to use it, even if it's for an approved use. And so we were able to work with those patrons on some amendments to basically make that possession and that sort of thing a felony, but have a specific carve out that's very, very clear for veterinary use. And so we wouldn't have any trouble with our veterinarians getting that important useful drug into the state. PFAS was another big issue this year. We knew that was going to be a big one. There were a lot of bills on PFAS, but kind of everyone kind of came together and rallied around one bill, which was House Bill 1025 and Senate Bill 243. I think everyone kind of agreed that PFAS is a big issue, but the place that we want to focus right now is on public drinking water monitoring and testing. And so this bill kind of sets up that system for how DEQ is going to monitor and test public drinking supplies for PFAS contamination, and then gives DEQ some authority to do additional testing upstream from that of potential sources, kind of as they find it necessary. And so a lot of our industry folks, that are in the manufacturing space and others may be impacted by this at some point, but I think, industry has done a really good job of kind of recognizing the issue of PFAS. Biosolids is another area where we want to keep a close eye on this. And I think that the advisory committee, which is intentionally left very broad and a lot of latitude for the director of DEQ and Secretary of Natural Resources to kind of choose who is on that and how that function is going to be very important. And so agriculture is likely going to have a seat on that. I doubt it will be the Agribusiness Council, but it might be the Biosolids Council, Farm Bureau, someone else, but we'll be following that really, really closely to make sure that we are staying on top of the PFAS issue in general. This is something that I kind of say from time to time is probably something that we're going to be working for the rest of our careers as we continue to work in the agriculture policy space. But there's a lot of interplay with what EPA is doing now on the federal level as well. And so that all kind of comes into play. This is going to be a hot topic actually this week at the Environment Virginia Symposium up in Lexington, which I'm going to be at. And so we're going to continue to talk about this too. Above ground storage tanks. Those of you who have followed along with the General Assembly for the past several years will remember this coming up pretty perennially. Alfonso Lopez, who again now the chairman of the House Ag Committee, this is kind of a pet issue for him. We realized that this issue was not going away, and so the Virginia Manufacturers Association and others, along with us as a part of that group, kind of worked to reach a compromise with Delegate Lopez this year. Originally, the bill would have said any above ground storage tank, basically of almost any size, would have to register with DEQ, and there was a whole kind of regulatory scheme that was set up around that. Number one, it was very onerous to industry and unnecessary. Number two, it was going to be very, very expensive for DEQ to implement. And so that bill, we were pretty much, that bill died every year. But with kind of the political winds being what they are, and knowing that this issue is not going away, and also knowing that there is some work again at the federal level that EPA is doing on this with regard to the new regulations under the Clean Water Act. The compromise that we kind of reached is that tanks that are already going to be subject to that EPA Clean Water Act hazardous substance worst case discharge planning regulation, which should be finalized sometime in the next year, I think, should also submit evidence of compliance to DEQ. So basically their hazardous substances discharge plan to DEQ, and then a couple other things about who is responsible, and who on the local level is kind of the responsible for that as well. So we ended up being neutral on this compromise. Most agribusiness council members will not be affected, except the very, very large ones who are already going to have to be in compliance with EPA. But folks like our green industry, lawn care folks who would have been required to comply with the previous legislation will not have to comply with this. And so I think we ended up in a good spot there, and kind of taking that issue off the table, at least for the next few years, hopefully. Groundwater was another really, really big issue. Really just one senator, Senator Stewart, had several bills related to groundwater, especially in the Eastern Virginia aquifer, anything east of 95, basically. For years, we have the Eastern Virginia Groundwater Management Program and the advisory committee, which we serve on and attend those meetings. So this is a big deal for a lot of our industrial members, for our poultry and pork and those types of folks, but also individual farmers who have wells as well on that issue. So there were lots of bills introduced by Senator Stewart this year to kind of get at this issue. It's kind of a passion project for him. So there was a specific issue up in the Occoquan area, Occoquan aquifer. There was a bill related to kind of what data DEQ collects and how they use that data. It was probably a pretty good bill. There was also a very bad bill, which would have created a permit moratorium for any new groundwater withdrawal permits in the groundwater area. And that bill died. But the one bill that I would say we worked the most on was SB 673, which would have required DEQ to prioritize withdrawal permits for human consumption, which they basically already do through their current process. But this was also amended to include food production as well. So we think that would have included folks like our meat and poultry processing folks. We did oppose this bill on behalf of our industrial and our forest products members who really or who also would be very much impacted by this. The food production language was removed after it passed the Senate, and the bill passed the Senate. To get into the weeds a little bit, it had two different hearings and two different Senate committees, and testimony was not heard in either case. So we didn't really get our chance to make our case in front of the committees. And Senator Stewart, the bill almost died. Senator Stewart was very, very passionate about why it should pass. And so it passed the Senate. It did come over to the House Chesapeake subcommittee, and we were able to kill it there. So just another issue that is not going away. I think the State Water Commission is going to be looking at this issue over the next year. And again, the Eastern Virginia Groundwater Management Authority, which meets pretty much on a quarterly basis, is going to continue to work on this. There's been several attempts in the past to by industry to kind of come up with some additional best practices to use with groundwater regulations. Unfortunately, none of those have as of yet been considered by the state, and so we'll probably be going we'll probably be going back to some of those items that are kind of collecting dust on a shelf, to see if we can dust those off and work on some things moving forward. A couple of bills from Senator Sturdivant. These aren't really related, but just as of the patron, the first one would have prevented any foreign adversary or foreign business from purchasing land in Virginia. This was similar. This kind of expanded on the bill from last year, which is this, but in the ag space, ag land. This was opposed by the banking and credit industry regarding implementation, and we expressed concerns as well on kind of behalf of those industries in the council. It died in the Senate Finance Committee. We didn't have to end up speaking against it, but we knew it was going to die a pretty easy death. Mandatory E-Verify was the other one, and so what the council's position has always been is that E-Verify is not necessarily a bad idea, but the program as it stands right now has a lot of issues. It's unwieldy for employers. It sometimes returns false positives, false negatives, and the process for getting foreign workers is complicated enough right now. And so our policy has always been, let's not mandate E-Verify until we can fix some of these other issues that are plaguing this process. And so this would have mandated any employer using foreign labor use E-Verify. This was modeled after some legislation in Florida, I believe. So the council, the seafood industry, and some other business groups expressed opposition. We did end up, he amended the bill in the Senate Commerce and Labor Committee to make it apply to some much larger businesses, but we still expressed opposition, and it died in the Senate Commerce and Labor Committee. But that's probably something that's going to continue to pop up from time to time. Some other things, just very briefly, because I know we're getting short on time, and I want to have some time for questions if anyone has them. The potato board has had trouble. That it's a very small industry in terms of the number of farmers in Virginia, and so we've had some issues getting quorums and that sort of thing for the potato board. So the industry came up with a bill to reduce the membership of that board to kind of make it more efficient. And so we supported that, and that bill passed with no problems. There were several bills related to animal cruelty this year, and I can get in the weeds on that with anyone who wants to talk about it. But the biggest one that would have impacted our industry would have required additional reporting by universities at a very micro level. That was going to be very expensive and time consuming and really unnecessary for all the universities, but especially Virginia Tech and all the animal research that they do. And so this was negotiated between the universities and the animal rights groups to a study/work group that's going to be meeting, directed by VDACs, and meeting over the next year or so. The Forest Conservation Plan, this was a Chesapeake Bay Foundation bill. We negotiated this with Chesapeake Bay Foundation, Farm Bureau, the Forestry Association, and others were involved with this. And we ended up supporting this legislation as long as there's some additional work that Department of Forestry needs to do, including probably a new position that they would need to implement this. And so we kind of supported this with the caveat that this is probably good policy as long as it is funded, and it ended up being funded in the state budget. But we'll see how in about 10 minutes how that ends up going. The biosolids storage bill, this was some changes to how biosolids have to be stored and kind of the regulations around that. This was carried by Delegate Bulova, requested by the Biosolids Council. We supported this, and it passed unanimously. I told you I'd get back to the Ag B&P tax credits. These are all things that have been around for the last few years regarding equipment and that sort of thing to implement some of our ag best management practices. This was extending the sunset. We've gotten away in the state from doing kind of just tax credits that exist in perpetuity. Everything has a sunset on it now, usually at 5 years. And so these bills were all kind of moving that sunset forward an additional 5 years. And I think they have been probably one of the most effective ways of getting farmers to invest in some of these things for our Ag B&Ps with our Chesapeake Bay work. The Virginia Verified Meat Program, this was a priority of the Virginia Cattlemen's Association to create a verified meat program in the state that will be set up by VDACs but administered by the cattlemen. This is, if an animal is born, raised, and slaughtered in Virginia, they can get this additional verification. There is a little bit of money that was funded in the budget for the startup cost for this, but this is something that was a priority for the cattle industry. We were happy to help support that as well. On the resilience front, this is something that's a pretty hot topic as well. But this bill creates a standalone new position in the governor's office under the Secretary of Natural Resources. Originally, this position would have been under the governor itself, but it was amended to be under the secretary to coordinate resilience efforts among state agencies. This came out of a work group that we participated in 2023, kind of looking at what are best practices from other states, really around how do we coordinate to make sure we're getting the most bang for our buck from some of the federal dollars that are out there, private dollars. How are we communicating about the resilience work, flood resilience, and other things, especially in our coastal areas, but not just coastal areas, as we've seen here in Southwest Virginia, some of the flooding. But how are we working together to make sure that we're getting the most value for that? And so looking at some other states, we came up with this idea, and this legislation came out of that, so we were happy to support that. And then the last one on this list, tribal consultation. You probably remember these bills have come up in the past, but basically requires federally recognized tribes to be consulted on certain environmental permits. The bill that came up this year, and this was a very big priority for Delegate Krizik, who is someone that we work with quite a bit on things. This was a big priority for him. This was a better bill than the ones that have come up last year from a technical standpoint. There in the past, there had been kind of an opportunity for tribes to actually veto certain permits. That was not included in the bill this year. So we decided to kind of hang back and stay neutral on this. And the administration worked a lot. DEQ and the Secretary's office worked a lot to make sure that this was technically, this bill was technically correct in how it was going to operate and that sort of thing. And so we'll see how this develops over the next few years and see kind of how this program is. But this was something that we decided to stay out of this year, and others, Farm Bureau and others, decided to do the same. Let's see. All right, oyster leases would have changed the way we do oyster leases. This was a bad bill. He struck it. And then another one, Forest Sustainability Fund allocation formula. This is a really technical bill about how the Department of Forestry allocates the Forest Sustainability Fund, and we supported that. It passed unanimously. All right, getting into the budget update, and I say all this with the caveat that in 7 minutes, all this might be going away. But full funding for ag BMPs, additional staff at DCR, and then also some additional funding for operations at soil and water conservation districts. The governor had taken out full funding for the dairy margin coverage premium assistance program. The budget reinstated that, which we were happy to see. Some more money, up to $5 million for animal disease indemnification, as some of the things we're seeing in the news with avian influenza and now how it's impacting our dairy industry. This, I think is omnipresent and very important to do this. Additional funding for the Wildlife Damage Cooperative Program, which has really been a successful partnership between VDACs and USDA APHIS. Startup money, like I mentioned, for the Verified Meat Program, additional money for the Blue Catfish Program, something that we worked on for years, even since Heidi and I were serving in the last administration, is a new policy analyst position for the Virginia Department of Forestry, and that was included. VDOF does so much, we're asking them to do even more, and they're really short-staffed. So those technical amendments about the Office of Working Lands that I mentioned, support for Department of Forestry to use an outside consultant for the biomass carbon life cycle analysis. You might remember that from last year. We've been working on that, doing the initial analysis over the last year, but we kind of realized to dig in and really do a true carbon life cycle analysis, we need some outside help. And so there's some money in there for that. an additional $2.5 million for the Forest Sustainability Fund, which is a lot less than what we asked for, but I think continuing to make incremental investments in that and showing its efficacy is going to be really important moving forward. The money and support staffing for the Forest Conservation Plan that I mentioned. Love both of these. Increased funding for Virginia Natural Resources Leadership Institute, known as VN-Early, and also the Center for Rural Virginia. And I also mentioned there was legislation passed. Not only did it pass unanimously, but it was co-patroned unanimously by all 140 members of the legislature to rename the Center for Rural Virginia after former Senator Frank Ruff. And so it's now the Senator Frank Ruff Center for Rural Virginia, which is very, very exciting. And the governor actually did a bill signing for that a couple of weeks ago, which we were at. Various funding items across several agencies, like I said, on invasive species. And so VDAX, DOF, DEQ, and DCR, and I think Wildlife Resources all got some money for invasive species work as well. All right, looking ahead, so we'll continue to work on some of these issues. Work groups are continuing this summer. They're starting to get set up probably in the next 2 weeks after the reconvene session. Also, those regulatory processes. One big one that I'm looking forward to kind of seeing what comes up is the solar siting HB 206 regs should be coming out of DEQ pretty soon from the last couple of years. Reconvene sessions on the 17th, and we will continue to meet and develop relationships with all these new folks. Even though we got a good start this year, there's still a lot of work to do there. So any questions that anyone has, we'll be happy to answer those. Just put them in the chat, and be happy to kind of dig into the weeds a little bit more. But there's our contact information below. So if you have any other questions, feel free to shoot us an email and we'll be happy to respond. And then finally, thank you again to Rise for sponsoring this. Thanks again to Rise for all the good work that they do and for the support that they give us, and the partnership that we have. And I think that with the bills that came up this session, that really was important. And so thanks again to them.
And I just want to take this opportunity to kind of pat my team on the back. Brad and Heidi are a constant source of pride. We get to brag about having the best team in Richmond. And it's not just Brad and Heidi. We have a lot of really strong partners across a lot of organizations. It is interesting to see how many people are surprised to see us in rooms or in meetings because they don't assume ag needs to be there, but there were very few conversations of note this year that did not include one of the three of us in it. So thank you all for your support. Thanks to the entirety of the VAC membership, but a special pat on the back to Brad and Heidi this year. As you can see, we spent a lot of time up here. It's a lot of work. So I am not seeing any questions in chat. That said, this is obviously not the end of that conversation. Please feel free to reach out to any of us individually if you've got something you want to talk about off the books or offline. And we are available all the time. The conversations that we had this year are already starting for what it's going to look like next year. And, we have to remember this is usually a 2-year cycle. So we're only halfway through, and I'm looking forward to the next part of it. Our next activities coming up include a golf tournament, and we are scheduling an event in the Valley this year and for next month. And we're excited to try out a new speaking event. So our hopefully will be a good opportunity. So please feel free to reach out to me personally or Brad and Heidi at any time. And thank you all for participating.